Hi, seniors. This is for Disco. I know I haven't made a video in a few days, but I'm going to try to be a little bit more consistent. I'm trying to get the material to stretch out for till the end of the semester, because like in this time we probably would have been in the past couple of weeks we probably would have been listening to 90s music, and I'll be showing you things from 90s culture. Um, but so apart from the content, but today we're going to talk about I hope everybody's doing well. I know it's this is very rough, all of this quarantining and everything, and I know we're going on, what is it, week 6, and again, I feel terrible about everything that went down, especially with you guys missing a lot of our senior activities that I had planned for you. But we will try to still do as many things as we possibly can under these circumstances. All right, so today we're going to talk about Bill Clinton making his big political comeback in the election of 1996. Now, I know it was a few videos ago, but we talked about, Clinton having all these troubles politically because the Republicans won control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Newt Gingrich emerged as Clinton's biggest nemesis in 1995. He thought he had Bill Clinton on the run, basically, and then he totally miscalculated, passed a budget that called for big cuts to Medicare and Medicaid and environmental programs and education, big tax cuts for the rich. Clinton vetoed this budget. We had a government shutdown we had 2 government shutdowns, one for 6 days, one for 3 weeks in late 1995, early 1996. And ultimately, the Republicans in Congress had to back down because the government was not reopening and Clinton was not budging. Clinton definitely emerged the victor from this political battle with the Republicans, and they agreed to most of Clinton's demands, and Medicare and other programs were not cut, certainly not to the degree that they had wanted. So Clinton is now going into 1996, which is an election year, in much stronger shape than anybody could have imagined. Not only had he had that successful confrontation with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans, but also Clinton had, advice from a political advisor named Dick Morris, who basically moved into the White House and came up with the whole idea of triangulation, that Bill Clinton should try to pivot himself away from the liberal Democrats and away from the Gingrich Republicans. So liberals, Gingrich Republicans, and then here he would be, and which is a centrist position that Morris believed that's where most of the American people were at, and this would actually get them to support Bill Clinton. So that was a successful calculation. Bill Clinton seemed completely reasonable compared with Newt Gingrich, who had this pretty radical conservative agenda, the contract with America, and all of that. So the thing is that Clinton emerged in very strong shape, even though, especially looking back, a lot of liberals were very angry at Bill Clinton because they felt that Bill Clinton, in attempting to triangulate, had actually given away way too much. In his State of the Union address in January 1996, Clinton actually said the era of big government is over. Not something you'd expect to hear from a Democrat. So a lot of people thought, especially after the fact, when people were looking back at the Clinton years, saying that, you just gave away too much. You gave away the Democratic Party agenda, basically, in an attempt to save yourself. And a lot of this feeling really harmed Hillary Clinton when she ran for president in 2016. A big part of the reason why a lot of liberals just never trusted her. Well, it was deep. There's a lot of reasons, but one of the big reasons is because they identified her with Bill Clinton's triangulation away from liberal priorities. There probably was no better example of Clinton kind of pivoting away from liberal ideals than in his embrace of welfare reform. Now, you remember, Bill Clinton had made welfare reform a strong position of his since the 1992 campaign. Remember, he said welfare should be a second chance, not a way of life, which again is a very different position than most Democrats hold, or at least publicly espouse. So Clinton had always said he was for welfare reform, trying to get people on welfare into jobs, even though he really didn't talk much about the issue in his first 2 years as president. He focused on healthcare reform and a whole lot of other issues, but he kind of pivoted away from welfare reform. But when the Republicans won control over Congress, they embraced the cause of welfare reform, and they were determined to hold Bill Clinton to his pledge to actually reform welfare. Now, I let's talk a little bit about the whole idea of welfare reform. Now, welfare was basically a political and policy dead weight for the Democratic Party and for the liberal cause for a generation. There's nothing that made regular middle Americans, maybe not even just conservatives, just like, regular folks, centrists, center right people, and certainly right wing people, nothing made them angrier probably than the idea that people were going on welfare and not working. The idea that people were too lazy to find jobs and were basically living off the government that was, giving them money for not working, giving them money for having extra children, basically subsidizing, this lifestyle. I don't know what kind of lifestyle it is exactly, but basically subsidizing people not working. And well, again, even if you're not a conservative, most people work hard every day. They pay their taxes. They're responsible citizens. So it makes a lot of Americans very angry. The idea that some people are gaming the system, that they're getting money from my taxes basically to support themselves and not work. So this was something that Republicans used to beat Democrats over the head with for a generation. Ronald Reagan ran against the welfare queen in the 1980 campaign, where he basically said, liberals are too soft. They're supporting people not getting jobs and living off the government. So this had been a very important cause for Republicans forever, for decades. And Bill Clinton said he's for welfare reform, so the Republicans were determined to hold him to that. But the Republican version of welfare reform was much harsher than anything that Bill Clinton envisioned. For instance, Republicans did not believe that people should be able to get welfare for any additional children. So if you're a woman and you have two children and you're on welfare and then you have a third child, Republicans said, or fourth or whatever, the government should not support your extra children beyond what you had when you first signed up for welfare. They also believe that people under 18 should not get welfare because there was this argument, or at least this thought among a lot of conservatives, that a lot of young women were having children just because they figured, well, I'll just get welfare and I'll get away from my parents and I can set up my own house with my kids and be on welfare. I don't know how accurate that is, but that was certainly a perception that a lot of Republicans had. So they were for that. Not giving you money for additional children. They also didn't believe that the government really should help you out with childcare. Because if you have to have a job now, if you're supposed to get off welfare and get a job, then where are you going to leave your kids? Clinton said that that's a must if we have welfare reform, even though Republicans really didn't make that a priority at all. Job training. If we want people on welfare to get jobs, what kind of jobs can they get if they're not trained for anything? So the version of welfare reform that the Republicans favored was much harsher than any of the welfare reform ideas that Bill Clinton had. And Clinton actually vetoed Republican passed welfare reform twice because he said it was overly harsh. The Republicans were determined to pass it a third time in 1996. They would strip out some of the harsher provisions that Clinton objected to, like not giving you money for any extra children and things like that. So it was a more moderate version of welfare reform than they had pushed earlier. So Republicans made a political calculation when they passed welfare reform in 1996. They said, well, if Clinton signs it, then we get a major policy achievement because this is something that Republicans had wanted forever. But if Clinton vetoes it, then we have a political issue to use against him in the 1996 election. So a lot of Republicans thought it was win-win. So Clinton basically had to decide what he was going to do in mid 1996. Is he going to go along with this? It's still harsher than he would have wanted, but this is an election year, and Bill Clinton had always said he was for welfare reform, so Clinton decided to sign the welfare reform bill. Now, the reaction from a lot of people in the Democratic Party was very mixed. Some in the more centrist wing of the Democratic Party supported Clinton signing welfare reform, but some liberals, in fact, a lot of liberals, were furious at Bill Clinton for a Democratic president to actually buy in to the Republican propaganda that people just live on welfare and basically sign a bill that they argued was going to send millions of children into poverty. Because if you cut off welfare, then how are the children going to live? Was the argument that a lot of liberals made. Now, the bill that became law when Bill Clinton signed it, again, not as harsh as what the Republicans wanted at first, but it was still pretty tough. For one, it ended the whole idea that welfare was a federal entitlement. Now, entitlement is when if you meet a certain criteria, you automatically get it. Like Social Security and Medicare, you're 65, you automatically get it. So it's an entitlement. Welfare was an entitlement too, in the sense, well, you're poor, so you have children, you can automatically get welfare. So it ended that. It wasn't an entitlement anymore. It was no longer even a federal program. The federal government just sent money to the states, and then the states could administer welfare however they wanted. It said that you had to find a job in 2 years. You couldn't stay on welfare for longer than that, and you couldn't be on welfare for longer than 5 years in your entire life. It also ended welfare for legal immigrants, which was very harsh. But they argued that, well, if you come to America, you should be able to support yourself and not live off the government. Now, the thing is that welfare reform is it was a big debate in the 1990s, and the liberals said that it's going to result in catastrophic increases in poverty, but in reality, that really didn't happen. 7 million people moved from welfare to work. The welfare rolls dropped by 60%. Some liberals after the fact say, well, these people just disappeared. We don't exactly know, what happened to them. While people who support welfare reform said, well, they went and got jobs, which was exactly the point of welfare reform. But the main legacy, politically at least, even though the debate continues with the merits of welfare reform, which is still on the books to this day, even though he did win concessions. The next year, they took out the provision that banned welfare for legal immigrants. Clinton did get child care funding, in the welfare reform bill. He also got Republicans to agree to an increase in the minimum wage, which is not something that Republicans generally favor. So Clinton argued that he made the best of this situation, even though a lot of liberals were still furious with him. I remember Bernie Sanders bringing up against Hillary the fact that Bill Clinton had signed welfare reform. And he was proud to have opposed it. So it's still out there as an issue, even though you could argue it's been settled. So anytime Republicans bring up, oh, the Democrats just want people to go on welfare, that's just not accurate, because that's not even possible anymore because of the welfare reform bill that was passed in 1996. All right, so this is an election year, and Clinton was stronger than ever in many ways when he's going into the 1996 election. Now, the likely Republican candidate in 1996 was a man named Bob Dole. Now, I don't know if that name will mean anything to people your age, but Bob Dole, for people my age and older, certainly older, Bob Dole was a legendary politician. He had been in the United States Senate for 27 years. He was the Senate Majority Leader in the 1996 election. He was a constant presence. I think him and John McCain had made the most appearances on Meet the Press ever. He was a constant appearance in American life in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. He was Gerald Ford's running mate in 1976. He had twice ran for the Republican nomination himself in 1980 and 1988 unsuccessfully. Dole also was mocked continually on Saturday Night Live. Dan Aykroyd used to play Bob Dole. Bob Dole spoke in a monotone like this, and it was constantly mocked on SNL. You can check it out on YouTube if you're curious. Dole was a wounded veteran of World War II. His entire left arm was useless. It was still there, but it was just kind of stuck to his side. And he always had a pen in his right hand to kind of keep it still. So Bob Dole did not have the use of his right arm. As a result of catastrophic injuries he suffered in the Second World War. He was in the hospital for over 3 years. He lost his kidney. It was a catastrophic wound. And Dole rebuilt his life and ultimately became, arguably America's most successful politician. At least he never became president, but he was he was the most prominent Republican in the country. And Dole was a Midwestern conservative, an old-fashioned Republican. He really was not a fan of Ronald Reagan's big tax cuts and supplies economics, trickle-down economics, cut taxes for the rich, and then there won't be any deficits. All that kind of Republican thinking of the 1980s. Dole was really not with that. Dole was your traditional conservative. We need a balanced budget. Not a hardcore right-winger by any means, but definitely a conservative, more in the old-fashioned school. Dole also had a reputation for being pretty aggressive, playing hardball politically. They used to call him the hatchet man. The Democrats did, and the media, because of his aggressive tactics. Hatchet man. The name that they called him. Some people on the right, on the really conservative side of the Republican Party, didn't trust Bob Dole, because Bob Dole was your traditional Republican who was willing to make deals with Democrats in Congress, who was willing to find middle ground, who did not really believe that the Democrats and liberals were the enemy. So a lot of really right-wing people never really trusted Dole completely. So when Dole ran for the nomination in 1996, he had some opposition. Pat Buchanan, remember, who ran in 1992 against George Bush for the Republican nomination, had very, what they used to call paleo-conservative views. He was an American nationalist. The pre-Trump, in many ways, he was for high tariffs. He was for immigration restrictions. He was also very traditional in terms of his views on abortion, and was also seen as basically a fascist sympathizer. He spent a lot of his life as a journalist, saying that writing histories where maybe we should never have fought the Germans in World War II, kind of having a sympathetic line toward a lot of history's right-wing villains. He once said Hitler was a man of courage. So Pat Buchanan was running for the nomination and actually won the New Hampshire primary, beating Dole. Also running was Steve Forbes, the publisher of Forbes magazine, who basically ran on a flat tax, saying everyone should pay a flat 70% tax. But these were, when you think about it, these were not political heavyweights at all. So Dole wound up winning the Republican nomination, wrapping up support. Most regular middle of the road to regular conservative Republicans supported Bob Dole. Basically, it was his turn. He had been asking to be the nominee really as long as anybody could remember, almost that he earned it. He deserved this nomination. And who else really was there? Dole was 73 years old when he won the Republican nomination, which at the time was the oldest candidate ever to receive a presidential nomination. His record is going to be beaten this year by Donald Trump, who will be 74, and Joe Biden will be 70, who is 77. So Dole's record was beaten, but at the time, Dole being 73 years old actually was a big issue. Basically, is he too old to basically be president? Bill Clinton had a great response when they asked him at a presidential debate, "Do you think Bob Dole is too old?" And he said, "No, it's the age of his ideas that I question," which was a really good retort. Now, Dole had a lot of problems going into this election. He was badly behind in the polls. Really, not exactly the most charismatic candidate. Really, against a surging Bill Clinton. Also, Clinton actually, you know, Clinton was ahead for most of the election. So Dole decided to do some really three very bold things to shake up the presidential race. One, he resigned the Senate seat that he had held for 27 years in Kansas. He was a senator from Kansas. And he resigned his Senate seat and his position as majority leader in order to focus on the presidential campaign. And I remember I was 13 or something, and I remember watching him resigning from the Senate, and he gave a speech I still remember, where he said that, he said, even if talking about the presidential election, even if this doesn't work out, I'll be the same man I was yesterday, the same man I was the day before that. The sun will still rise in the east and life will go on, even if I don't win. And that's very good advice, guys, just to kind of keep in mind if something in our own lives don't work out, right? That's something to keep in mind. That was, I think, really good advice. I have to tell you, I do not support Bob Dole's politics at all, but on a personal level, I've always been a fan. He's he's a conservative Republican. I don't agree with him personally, politically, but he was a good man, a decent man, somebody who had a sense of honor, integrity, somebody who was just decent. And I don't know if that completely came across in the '96 election, but I've still I like Bob Dole on a personal level. Also has a wicked sense of humor. He's still alive. He's 97 years old, and he's in very poor health. But he's he's a good man. I've always felt, and that speech always stuck with me. So he resigned his Senate seat. Then he picked as his running mate a man named Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp may not mean anything to you guys now, but Jack Kemp was a legendary congressman from Buffalo for many years. He used to be a professional football player. He played for the Buffalo Bills. As their quarterback. Then he got into politics. He was probably the biggest supporter after Ronald Reagan of the idea of slashing taxes as a way to rejuvenate the economy. He also prided himself on having very good relations with the black community. I'm not sure how much of that was reality or in his mind. But he was definitely kind of like an optimistic, sunny conservative, they used to say, a big supporter of tax cuts. And remember what I told you before, Bob Dole actually wasn't the biggest supporter of tax cuts. So this actually involved quite a pivot by Bob Dole to actually pick Jack Kemp as his running mate. And Kemp and Dole kind of had a fraught personal history. Kemp had once said about Dole, he told a joke. Oh, there was a bad news. There was a fire in Bob Dole's library, and the book was burnt up. The book, meaning only one book in his library, and he hadn't even finished coloring it yet. Ouch. So they didn't have the best relationship, and they really didn't agree on policy so much, but Dole thought that picking Kemp would be a good way to kind of like shake up the race. 2 4-letter words you could teach to your kids. Dole Kemp. I remember him saying. Dole also ran on a 15% across the board tax cut, which again is something that he would not have favored in the early part of his career. He'd always been skeptical of the whole idea of tax cutting. But again, this would be very expensive, and Clinton kind of hit him over the head with it, saying that this is mainly going to benefit the wealthy, and it's not something that America could afford. Now, his acceptance speech also drew attention. I remember watching this speech, and if anything, if you're 73 years old, you probably should try to look more future oriented. But he kind of, the speech, which was well written, but it wasn't the best speech politically, because he basically said, I want to be a bridge to the past. Dole said, let me be a bridge to a time that only the unknowing call myth. Let me be a bridge to a time of tranquility, of faith, of confidence and action. And if you say it wasn't so, I tell you you're wrong. I know, I was there, I remember. And he was talking about the 1950s, of course. So it was a very backwards looking speech. And Clinton used that speech to actually come up with his campaign slogan, saying that I'm not going to be a bridge to the past, I'm a bridge to the 21st century. And he used that as his campaign slogan, which he got by actually mocking Dole's speech. Now, one big issue that was actually, I know this is long, guys, so I hope you've been watching consistently. Good for you if you have. One thing that was dogging Bill Clinton pretty consistently in the 96 campaign was another scandal. This time it wasn't a sex scandal or a money, well, I guess it was a money scandal, but it wasn't of a personal nature. It was allegations that the Chinese government had funneled contributions to the Democratic Party. Which Clinton denied, and Clinton said, I knew nothing about this. Even though it was, they got a guy who was actually a fundraiser, who was actually getting money from the Chinese government and trying to use as a middleman. His name is John Wang, I think. He was a middleman between the Chinese government and various Democratic Party entities. So this kind of became an issue in the 96 campaign. Also, Al Gore, Bill Clinton's running mate, held a fundraiser in a Buddhist temple, which actually is illegal. You're not allowed to raise money in a religious institution. And then Gore said, I don't remember doing that. And then they found a video of Gore with the monks. So that was kind of embarrassing. It turned out that Bill Clinton had actually let campaign contributors sleep in the Lincoln bedroom, which was really seen as kind of unseemly, right? You know, Lincoln bedroom is like the most honored place in the entire White House, and just to allow people there who just gave you money was just kind of seen as really distasteful. Then Dick Morris, remember that political advisor that Bill Clinton had that basically gave him the advice to help him win re-election, to triangulate. Dick Morris got caught in a scandal where he was caught with a prostitute, and it came out all sorts of embarrassing details about how the prostitute used to suck his toes, and you can only imagine what kind of attention that got. So Bill Clinton had to fire Dick Morris. So we still had this air of scandal, which often followed Bill Clinton, to be honest. With the Chinese contributions and the Lincoln bedroom being rented out and the toe-sucking escapades of Dick Morris. So it didn't help, Clinton, but he was still really far ahead in the polls. Also, Ross Perot, we remember our friend Ross Perot, who ran in the 1992 election, did very well, even though he behaved in a very erratic manner, right? Remember dropping out because people were following him, then re-entering the race, but ultimately winning 19% of the vote. Ross Perot founded his own political party in the intervening years called the Reform Party, saying that I just want to create this party. I have no interest in using this as a way to advance myself. Of course, that turned out to be totally false. Ross Perot decided after he created the party that he wanted to be the party's nominee for president, and he got the nomination. But Perot was nowhere near as popular in 96 as he was in 92. The novelty had wore off. Plus, there were a lot of people who felt like he was just basically kind of a kook. And then he wasn't included in the presidential debates between Clinton and Dole. So he didn't have anywhere near the support in 96 that he had in 92. Ultimately, in the election, Bill Clinton won not a landslide, but a pretty solid victory. He won 49% of the vote to 41% of the vote for Dole to 8% for Perot. In the Electoral College, it was 379 for Clinton and 159 for Dole. So it was a pretty solid victory, second-term victory for Bill Clinton. All right, guys. So thank you for bearing with me. The video was quite long, but I wanted to do the whole election in this one video. In our next few videos, and this should be exciting. We're going to talk about the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, the sex scandal that almost brought him down, almost ended his presidency, full of all sorts of unbelievable and sordid details. So we're going to get into all of that in our subsequent videos. All right, I hope you guys are doing well, and I'm thinking about you. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.